I never thought a plate of eggs could change my life, but that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning at the Bluebird Diner on 5th Street. I'd been going there for about 3 months, always ordering the same thing, always sitting at the same booth by the window, always keeping my head down in my laptop while I ate. I was working remotely for a tech startup, and the diner had become my office, my escape from my tiny studio apartment where the walls felt like they were closing in on me. His name was Theo. I learned that from his name tag the first time I actually looked up long enough to notice him. He was the morning cook, and I could see him through the service window, moving with this quiet efficiency that I found oddly mesmerizing. Dark hair that fell across his forehead when he leaned over the grill, strong forearms dusted with flour, and this focused expression like cooking wasn't just a job, but something he actually cared about. I told myself I was just appreciating his work ethic. I told myself a lot of things back then. The first time something shifted was about 2 weeks into my regular visits. I'd ordered my usual scrambled eggs with wheat toast and black coffee. Nothing special, and when the waitress brought it out, there was this little garnish on top, fresh herbs arranged in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random. Chives and parsley formed into what almost looked like a tiny smile. I stared at it for a solid minute, wondering if I was reading too much into it, if maybe the cook did this for everyone. But when I glanced up at the service window, Theo was looking right at me. Our eyes met for maybe 3 seconds before he turned back to the grill, and I felt this flutter in my chest that I immediately tried to rationalize away. The next morning, I came back. Of course, I came back. And this time, my eggs had a different garnish, a little more elaborate, and there was an extra side of home fries I hadn't ordered. The waitress, an older woman named Denise who'd been working there probably longer than I'd been alive, set the plate down with a knowing smile. She didn't say anything, but I could feel her watching me as I looked toward the kitchen window. Theo wasn't visible this time, but I knew he was back there. I knew he'd made this for me specifically. I started paying attention to details I'd been ignoring. The way my coffee was always filled before I had to ask. The way my order came out faster than other people's even when the diner was packed. The tiny variations in my breakfast each day, like Theo was testing different things, trying to figure out what I liked best. One day the eggs were fluffier, cooked in butter instead of oil. Another day there were caramelized onions mixed in, sweet and savory. Each plate felt like a question he was asking without words. Each bite felt like my answer. I'm not stupid. I knew what was happening, or at least I was starting to suspect. But acknowledging it meant acknowledging something about myself that I'd been carefully avoiding for most of my 26 years. I'd had girlfriends in college, relationships that felt comfortable but never quite right. Like wearing shoes that were half a size too small. I'd told myself that was just what relationships were, that the movies and songs exaggerated what love felt like. But sitting in that diner booth, eating eggs that someone had made with obvious care, I felt something I'd never felt before. Anticipation, excitement, the kind of nervous energy that made my hands shake slightly when I lifted my coffee cup. 3 weeks in, Denise finally broke the silence. She refilled my coffee and leaned in slightly, her voice low enough that the other customers couldn't hear. She said, "Theo wants to know if you like the food." Just like that, simple and direct. I looked up at her, and she had this expression that was kind, but also challenging, like she was daring me to be honest. I told her it was the best breakfast I'd ever had, and I meant it. She nodded, satisfied, and walked away. When I glanced at the service window, Theo was there again, and this time when our eyes met, he smiled. It was a small smile, almost shy, but it hit me like a physical thing, warm and disorienting. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, finally letting myself think the thoughts I'd been pushing away. I thought about the way my heart sped up when I walked toward the diner each morning. I thought about how I'd started dressing a little better, paying attention to my hair, wearing the shirt that fit me best. I thought about how I'd catch myself smiling at nothing, remembering the way Theo looked when he was focused on cooking, the competence in his movements, the care he put into every plate. And I thought about what it meant that I was thinking about him at all, that a man I'd barely spoken to had become the best part of my day. The next morning, I almost didn't go. I stood outside my apartment building for 10 minutes, telling myself I could just make coffee at home, work from my couch, avoid the whole situation. But my feet carried me to the diner anyway, like they knew something my brain was still trying to deny. When I walked in, Denise greeted me with her usual nod, and I slid into my booth. I didn't even open my laptop. I just sat there, hands wrapped around my coffee mug, staring at the service window like it held all the answers to questions I was too scared to ask. My breakfast took longer than usual that morning. I watched the minutes tick by on my phone, watched other orders go out, and started to worry that maybe I'd imagined everything, that maybe Theo had just been doing his job and I'd built this whole fantasy in my head. But then Denise appeared with my plate, and it wasn't my usual order at all. It was an omelette, perfectly folded, stuffed with vegetables and cheese, with a side of fruit arranged in a rainbow pattern and 2 pieces of toast cut into triangles. It was beautiful, like something from a cooking magazine, and it must have taken 3 times as long as my usual scrambled eggs. But the real surprise came 30 seconds later. The kitchen door swung open and Theo walked out. He was still wearing his apron, wiping his hands on a towel, and he looked nervous in a way that made him seem younger than I'd thought he was. Maybe 28, maybe 30. He walked straight to my booth and stood there, and I realized with a jolt that this was the closest we'd ever been. I could smell the kitchen on him, butter and coffee and something herbal, and see the slight stubble on his jaw, the fleck of green in his otherwise brown eyes. He said, "I wanted to make sure you liked it." His voice was deeper than I'd expected, with a slight rasp that made me think of early mornings and quiet conversations. "I wanted to see your face when you tried it." I just stared at him for a moment, my brain completely blank, and then I managed to say something brilliant like, "You made this for me." He smiled at that, a real smile this time, and said, "I've been making breakfast for you every morning for 3 months. This one's just a little more honest about it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I picked up my fork and took a bite. The omelette was perfect, the eggs soft and creamy, the vegetables still crisp, the cheese melted just right. It was the kind of food that someone who really knew how to cook would make, not diner food at all, but something personal and deliberate. I looked up at Theo, and he was watching me with this intensity that made my chest tight. I told him it was incredible, and he let out this breath like he'd been holding it, like my opinion actually mattered to him. He asked if he could sit down, and I nodded, too surprised to do anything else. He slid into the booth across from me, and suddenly the dynamic shifted. We weren't cook and customer anymore. We were just 2 people sitting together, and the possibility of what that meant hung in the air between us. He told me his name was Theo, even though I already knew, and I told him mine was Adrian. He said he'd noticed me the first day I came in, noticed the way I always sat alone, always seemed lost in thought, and he'd wanted to talk to me but didn't know how. So he did what he knew how to do. He cooked. We talked for maybe 20 minutes until the breakfast rush started picking up and he had to get back to the kitchen. But in that short conversation, I learned more about him than I'd learned about most people I'd known for years. He'd gone to culinary school in Chicago, worked in a few high-end restaurants, but burned out on the pressure and the egos. He came back to his hometown, took the job at the Bluebird because it was simple and honest, because he could cook the way he wanted without someone breathing down his neck. He lived a few blocks away in an old Victorian house that he was slowly renovating. He read food blogs obsessively and tested recipes on his days off. He had a cat named Basil, and he'd been trying to work up the courage to talk to me for weeks. When he stood up to leave, he hesitated, then reached across the table and touched my hand. Just a brief touch, his fingers brushing my knuckles, but it sent electricity up my arm. He said, Come back tomorrow, and I'll make you something else. Something that tells you what I'm too nervous to say out loud." Then he was gone, back through the kitchen door, and I was left sitting there with half an omelette and a heart that wouldn't stop racing. I came back the next day, and the day after that. Each morning, Theo would make me something different, each dish more elaborate than the last, and each morning he'd come out to watch me eat it. We'd talk while I had breakfast, these conversations that started casual, but got deeper each time. He told me about his family, about how his dad had never understood why he wanted to cook, had pushed him toward business school or law. I told him about my own family, about growing up in a small town where being different meant being invisible, about moving to the city to find myself and still feeling lost most days. We never explicitly talked about what was happening between us. We didn't label it or define it, but it was there in every shared glance, every accidental touch, every moment of comfortable silence. I started staying later, nursing my coffee through the late morning, and Theo would take his break and sit with me. Sometimes Denise would bring us both pie, winking at me like she'd known all along how this would turn out. Other customers probably noticed, probably talked about the cook who kept coming out to sit with the guy in the corner booth, but I stopped caring what anyone else thought. About 6 weeks into this routine, Theo made me French toast. Not regular French toast, but this incredible version with brioche bread and a cardamom cream and fresh berries and a drizzle of honey. When he brought it out himself this time, he sat down before I'd even taken a bite. He looked at me with this serious expression and said, "I need to tell you something. I'm not good with words. I'm better with food. But I need you to know that every morning I wake up excited because I know you're coming in. I need you to know that I think about you when I'm testing recipes. I need you to know that this, whatever this is, it matters to me." My throat felt tight. I'd spent so many years avoiding feelings like this, convincing myself I was fine alone, that I didn't need the complication of a relationship. But sitting across from Theo, looking into his eyes and seeing my own nervousness reflected back at me, I realized I'd been lying to myself. I wasn't fine alone. I was lonely. And this man, this kind, talented, patient man, had been showing me every single day through food and attention and quiet presence that I didn't have to be lonely anymore. I told him I'd never done this before. I told him I'd spent my whole life thinking I was one thing, and now I was realizing I might be something else entirely, and it was terrifying and exhilarating, and I didn't know what I was doing. He reached across the table and took my hand, really took it this time, his thumb brushing across my knuckles. He said he was scared too. He said he'd known he was gay since he was 15, had come out to his family at 18. But that didn't make this any less scary. "Every time you put your heart out there," he said, "it's scary. But some people are worth being scared for." I don't remember deciding to lean forward. I just did. And he met me halfway across the table, and we kissed right there in the Bluebird Diner at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, with Denise watching from behind the counter and probably half a dozen other customers pretending not to notice. It was brief and soft and tasted like coffee and possibility. When we pulled apart, Theo was smiling and I was smiling, and I felt like something fundamental had shifted in my universe. We started really dating after that. Theo would finish his shift at 2 and I'd close my laptop and we'd spend the afternoon together. He took me to farmers' markets and taught me how to pick the best produce. I took him to bookstores and bought him cookbooks he'd mentioned wanting. We cooked together in his kitchen, and he was patient with my complete lack of skill, guiding my hands when I couldn't get the knife work right, laughing when I inevitably messed something up. We watched movies on his couch with Basil curled between us. We stayed up too late talking about everything and nothing. We learned each other slowly, carefully, like we both knew this was something precious that needed to be protected. The first time I stayed over at his place, I woke up to the smell of bacon. I found him in the kitchen, still in his pajama pants, cooking breakfast with the morning light coming through the windows. He looked over his shoulder when he heard me, and his whole face lit up. "Morning," he said, and I realized that this was what I'd been missing my entire life, not just romance or attraction, but this feeling of home, of rightness, of being exactly where I was supposed to be with exactly who I was supposed to be with. My parents came to visit 2 months later, and I was terrified. I'd never told them I was dating anyone, let alone dating a man. But Theo insisted on meeting them, said that if this was real, and it was, then hiding wasn't an option. We met them for dinner at a nice restaurant, and Theo was charming and warm and asked my dad about his work and complimented my mom's earrings. And by the end of the night, my mom was asking him for recipes, and my dad was talking to him about the house renovation. When we said goodbye, my mom hugged Theo first, then hugged me and whispered, "He's wonderful. Don't let him go." I promised her I wouldn't. Now it's been 8 months since that first garnished plate of eggs, and I still go to the Bluebird every morning. But now when Theo comes out to watch me eat, he slides into the booth next to me instead of across from me. Now he kisses me goodbye before he goes back to the kitchen. Now Denise calls us her boys and saves us the good pie. The other regulars have gotten used to us, and some of them have even started asking Theo for cooking advice, which he gives freely and enthusiastically. Last week, Theo made me breakfast at home before we both headed to the diner. Scrambled eggs with fresh herbs, arranged in a little pattern on the plate, just like that first morning. When I looked at him questioningly, he shrugged and said, "I wanted to remind you where we started. I wanted to remind you that I've been trying to tell you I love you since the beginning. I just needed you to be ready to hear it. I told him I loved him too, and I meant it with every part of me. This man who had been patient enough to court me with food, brave enough to walk out of his kitchen and risk rejection, kind enough to let me figure myself out at my own pace. He'd changed everything for me, helped me understand who I really was, what I really wanted. And what I wanted was him, every morning, every day for as long as he'd have me. So yeah, a plate of eggs changed my life. But more than that, the person who made them with such care and hope and quiet affection changed me. Theo taught me that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it's subtle and patient. Sometimes it's in the small gestures, the daily acts of care, the willingness to put yourself out there even when you're scared. Sometimes it's a cook coming out of his kitchen just to watch you eat, just to see if his feelings translate through the food he makes. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you're brave enough to taste what's being offered, and brave enough to admit that it's exactly what you've been hungry for all along. Total char count, 16,847.